Welcome to our first Silicon Valley Code Campfire. I'm excited to have Mickey Mantle and Ron Lichty here as our presenters. The track is basically managing programmers. Mickey and Ron have both been longtime Code Camp instructors. They've come and done sessions. They've worked at CodeStar Summit for us, and they've just been awesome volunteers over the years. Just by way of introduction of who's on this call, obviously, Mickey and Ron are here. Tammy's also here, who's going to be the moderator for the Q&A, which I'll explain in a minute. And Joy Tanny also is here as the backup, just in case things go really wrong sometime during the presentation. So basically, the way this is going to work is that I'm doing this little quickie 5-minute introduction, and then I'm going to start a pre-played video shown for the first time here of Ron's 45-minute presentation. And then after that, we'll switch back to Tammy, who will take questions from the YouTube discussion. So hopefully you guys can all see the discussion panel on the side of the YouTube channel, and you'll post your questions there. Tammy will consolidate them, and she'll ask to Ron and Mickey those questions for about 15 minutes. Then after that, we'll start Mickey's session. Following Mickey's session, we'll do exactly the same thing with Q&A. And then if all goes well, I'll do a little wrap at the end just to pat ourselves all on the back. What a great job we did. If not, you may never see me again in this event. Anyway, many of you have been asking about, is there going to be an in-person code camp? And the answer is, well, hopefully, but definitely wasn't one last year. There's definitely not going to be one this year. And my thinking is, when live events start coming back, we will definitely not be the first live event, but hopefully things will work out. So with that introduction, I'm going to switch over to the Ron presentation.
I'm Ron Lichty, and I'm here to talk to you about becoming a first-time manager or being a first-time manager. I have what I don't think is actually terribly unique experience in the fact that I've been a first-time manager 3 times, or maybe a first-time manager, a second-time manager, a third-time manager. I've had 3 transitions to management from programming. I began my career as a programmer, and I should start there. I began my career as a programmer, and I was a pretty good programmer. I wrote compiler code generators. I wrote compiler code cross compiler generators. I wrote multimedia applications. I wrote. I've got several patents actually in microcontroller device software that was at a time that in order to get a patent on software, it had to be connected with hardware. I thought I had the best job in the whole world, but after 7 years of coding, I thought, I'm curious about this managing thing. And I was in a 2-person company, and in a 2-person company, you don't get to manage. And it occurred to me, well, I got an offer to come manage at a very large company that was the only company that I was truly interested in. And that company was Apple Computer. Apple made me an offer to come manage a product management group, actually, in development tools. I managed that group for 1.5 years. I learned a ton, but I wasn't yet convinced that I wanted to stick to managing. And during one of Apple's many reorgs, I went back to programming. They made me a manager. 6 months later, during yet another reorg, I went back to programming. They made me a manager again. The thing that caused me to go back and forth was I really loved programming. I really loved the ecstasy of solving hard programming problems. At the same time, I continued to be curious about and continued to feel additional gratification and additional value that I was delivering, enabling teams. And that was ultimately what made the transition for me stick the third time, was the realization that while I was giving up the ecstasy of solving problems myself, I was creating an environment in which teams of programmers could thrive. That's the course. That's been the course of my career. I went from being a manager to I left Apple for my first director of engineering role at Berkeley Systems and screensavers and games and flying toasters and fish. I then went on to do entertainment software, the world's away software, online animated virtual worlds that were done inside of a very large company, Fujitsu. Went on from there to do entertainment software, from there to do financial services software at Charles Schwab. Got promoted to be a VP of engineering at Schwab and continued to lead engineering organizations through all of these companies. 2012, so that was about 9 years ago, I pivoted my career one more time to do consulting. I realized that the part of managing that I had enjoyed the most was, in fact, transforming chaos to clarity. It was coming into an organization that was struggling or that was not firing on all cylinders and getting that organization to truly hum. And so for the past 9 years, I have parachuted into organizations as an interim VP of engineering to make that, to help organizations hum and to find their long-term engineering leader. I have assessed organizations on behalf of VPs of engineering and CTOs and CEOs. I have trained teams in Agile, and I've trained executive teams in Agile to understand how they can support their teams that are using Agile. And I have coached a handful of engineering leaders, primarily VPs of engineering and CTOs. Mickey Mantle and I, this is my 5th book. It was my first collaboration with Mickey, and the two of us together spent 8 years writing Managing the Unmanageable at a time when there were very few books on managing software people and teams. There's still very few books. There are about twice as many as there were then, and there's still very few books. We went into Addison Wesley to our publisher Pearson's studios and spent an entire week recording our book as video training, live lessons managing software people and teams. At the end of this talk, I'll give you discount codes for both of these, for the book and for the video lessons. So be prepared to take a screenshot at the end of the talk. I'm also the co-author of the Study of Product Team Performance. Some of you actually may have been part of one of our surveys. We've had 7 studies now, I believe, in which we ask people on product teams all over the world to characterize their teams. Are they high performance or low performance or something in between? And then we ask about practices, and we have learned some very interesting things about practices that high performance teams do that low performance teams don't. My consulting practice, and I want to share this with you, one of the things that I realized as I began consulting, I looked back over all of the full-time management roles that I'd had and realized that for the most part, that it was rare that people were the problem. In fact, every company I've worked at and every client I've had as a consultant, they've all been unique. But the problems tend to fall into categories. And as I said, not people, but they tend to fall into categories of process, of culture, of communication, of planning, and of rigor. Those are 5 areas that you and I, engineering managers, can help to solve. So I want to give you a sampling of what good management is and what that transition to management looks like. So what is a good manager? So I've asked actually audiences of developers and of engineering managers, actually all over the world. I've asked audiences to tell me what they consider a good manager to be. And so let me give you the results from just one of those. So here's a list of the characteristics that one audience gave me. When I asked the question, what is a good manager? Now, I want you to look down this list and notice that there are only 2 bullets on this list that are technical. Now, I'm pretty sure that all programmers expect to have a manager who is technical. But what characterizes a good manager or a great manager? It's not the technical, it's not programming, it's not continuing to program. In fact, the 2 that I see here that seem like they've got a technical capability, one is being a domain expert, and one is being a visionary. And that visionary is oftentimes, sometimes it's on the product side, but more often it's on the engineering side. Where do we need to go? Where do we need to take our technology? What is that going to be about? Those 2 are have some element of technicalness in them. The rest of these are all people skills. The rest of these are all process skills. The rest of these are all relating to our team's skills. So let's start there. And let me move on to this anti-pattern, what I believe is an anti-pattern for managers, which is attempting to both code and manage. And I'll say a couple of things about attempting to both code and manage. We are likely, if we attempt to both code and manage, to do one of these things well, not both of them. And furthermore, the one we're going to tend to do well is probably the one where our comfort zone is. And our comfort zone is, for me, I had spent 8 years programming. And falling back into programming was by far the easiest thing. And so when I began managing, I attempted to not code, and absolutely, so, do some hobby coding, do some coding of some things that are not part of production, but don't put yourself in on the line for software delivery, for the software delivery that your team has to do. I think it's a real anti-pattern for managers. And then I want to share with you this rule of thumb for climbing the career ladder, which is also true when going from being a manager to a director and director to a VP. And that is, but it really is obvious when going from being a programmer to being a manager. And that rule of thumb is that the very thing that has made you successful at one level will get in your way in your next role. And it was clear to me, looking back on it, the thing that made me successful as a programmer was being able to shut out the world. The thing that made me successful as a programmer was being able to climb into the microprocessor and listen to its gates open and close. It was becoming one with my code. The thing that I needed to do to be successful as a manager was not only put a welcome mat out in front of my door, but to actively invite interruptions. The very thing that I had learned to block out as a programmer, I needed now to invite, because my team's concerns, my peers' concerns, and my manager's concerns were my concerns on behalf of my entire team. So let's break that down a little bit. So success as a programmer, highly honed coding skill, the ability to focus, the ability to block out distractions. Success as a manager, on the other hand, welcoming interruptions, focusing on enabling others, delegating work to members of your team that you could do better than they can. At least as a first-time manager, that's probably true. People skills, coaching skills, and empathy. Most of that long list that I showed you that audience gave me about their best managers. And then I want to note that success as a manager, we have too few role models. My role models had 201. My role models had been 2 ends of the scale. One, micromanagers, and the other, throw people in the deep end and watch them sink or swim. Those are not good role models for managers. Good role models for managers are delegators, people who delegate work and then support the individuals and the teams to get their work done. And then finally, success as a manager requires us to do dramatically more managing up and managing out than we've ever done before. And so that's a huge change for us as transitioning to management. So all of that comes back to this rule of thumb for climbing the career ladder. The very thing that's made you successful in your last role will get in your way in your next role. So let me share another rule of thumb, which is around delegation. Trust but verify. This is a rule of thumb that Mickey and I have both used. And trust but verify actually has a source. Some of you may recognize it. Ronald Reagan said, trust but verify. What you probably don't realize was that Ronald Reagan was quoting Vladimir Lenin, and Vladimir Lenin was in fact espousing a proverb, a Russian proverb, when he said trust but verify. The thing with trust but verify is that it embodies the imperative not to micromanage. It embodies delegation. It is the essence of delegation. It talks about setting expected outcomes for teams and about verifying that we're getting it. And so here's a second rule of thumb from Alan Lefkoff, who at the time I heard him say it, was the CEO of Natopia. Alan later told me he learned this rule of thumb: I inspect what I expect, that he learned that from Lou Gerstner, who later became the CEO of IBM. The two of them were both McKesson, they're both McKinsey consultants at the time that Alan Lefkoff learned this from Lou Gerstner. I inspect what I expect. Become a great manager, we need to be fair, we need fairness, and we need to be ethical and forthright and honest. A couple of rules of thumb around that. This one, leading by example occurs whether you like it or not. And another parallel one from Albert Schweitzer: example is not the most important way of influencing other people, it's the only way of influencing other people. And I like this one from Tim Swihart, this nugget of wisdom. All of these are in our book, by the way. We have a whole center section of rules of thumb that we have leveraged in our own work. Here's Tim saying, nothing undermines your credibility as a manager more completely than pounding on your team all year to get their work done on time and then telling them you don't have their reviews done because you were busy. Whatever you were busy with likely wasn't managing your people, so you've just proven to them that they don't matter. Good luck motivating them next year. Next, we need to facilitate communication. So one of my personal rules of thumb is that software development is a team sport. It has become my overarching rule of thumb as I've grown in management. Software development is a team sport, and team sports are gated by communication and collaboration. We need to facilitate communication. We need to communicate more, both within our teams and with the partners that we have in product management and marketing and sales. We need to communicate at every level, up, down, and sideways. Kimberly Weefling, one of my colleagues in the Silicon Valley engineering leadership community, Kimberly said, we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, use them in this ratio. She was not stating a new idea. I went charging down this one and discovered that this was said in Greek, not exactly the same words, but the idea was expressed in Greek 5,000 years ago. We can trace this statement back that far. And if we are truly communicating that way, where we're listening more than we're speaking, then I don't think we can over communicate. I don't think we in software development can over communicate. I think it might be possible that people in sales can over communicate. I think it might be possible that people in marketing can over communicate. I don't think we in software development can over communicate. I'm going to share with you this. Mickey and I found 3 thought leaders in motivation that we share, just a couple of pages of each. I'm going to share another one of them later. One of them, actually, you'll recognize Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Almost all of us ran across Maslow's hierarchy of needs somewhere along the way. This guy is Douglas McGregor, and Douglas McGregor in the and actually all three of them came from the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s. McGregor said that to become a good manager, we need to switch from the traditional management approach that he called Theory X management, which was telling people what to do, being directive, being authoritarian. He used the word repressive as that style of management that came from the Industrial Revolution, or maybe even before that. And we need to switch in thought leadership. We need to switch to what he called Theory Y management, where managers are supporting their teams. Our goal is to hold up our team. And McGregor, interestingly, used the words enabling and empowering and developmental and continuous improvement, which are the very words that Agile uses when it calls out the role for us as managers in Agile as servant leaders. Next, I want to address the idea that programmers are not all alike. Programmers, we can't manage the individuals on our teams in the same way. We need to uniquely manage each of the individuals on our team, or uniquely lead the individuals on our team. Our programmers differ by programming disciplines. And if you've thought about the difference between database developers and systems engineers and web developers, you know how true that is. They differ by generations. Baby boomers versus Generation X versus Generation Y. Morning people versus night people. And we see the transition from night people to morning people when some of the people on our team start having babies and start raising kids. Employees versus contractors manage in very different ways. Proximity, are people close to us? Are people in our time zone? Do we get to meet with people, or or do we have to manage from a distance? Cowboys versus farmers. Cowboys who go off on their own and disappear into the night to only come back with code when it's finished, versus farmers who plow their fields and are continually refactoring their code and making it better, and making the software base better for everyone. All of these require different thinking about managing, and each one of them, each individual on your team will have differences of these and others of the characteristics that we call out in our book and talk about managing. We need to, as managers, enable and build psychological safety on our teams. Now, this is an interesting one because the word psychological safety really didn't enter. It had been around as a term for a long time, but it really didn't enter our parlance in software development until about 5 years ago. So it's been around for a long time. So here's a definition from the Harvard professor who studies psychological safety, Amy Edmondson, who said psychological safety is a shared belief held by members of a team that the team is safe for interpersonal risk-taking. There's Amy Edmondson has written several books on teams and teaming and the fearless organization and other books. And she points out that anyone's voice at any time can be mission critical. So we need to make sure that everyone can step up. Everyone can bring their experience and expertise to the table without fear of taking that risk of sharing what they know. And this is particularly tough in software development circles, because we tend to be introverts. The reason that psychological safety has come into our parlance in the last 5 years was Google. Google, just like the rest of us, has high performance teams and low performance teams and teams in between. Google, unlike all the rest of us, has a ton of money, and Google spends that money studying everything. And one of the things they thought they'd study was, well, let's study our teams and see why we have high performance teams and low performance teams and teams that are in between. And so they set up the Aristotle team to do the Aristotle study, to study all of their teams and figure this out. The Aristotle team went into this believing that they were going to find some kind of magical team makeup, that high performance teams would have, you know, a 10x programmer, one of those mythical programmers who is 10 times as proficient as everybody else. Or maybe it would be all 10x programmers, or maybe it would be some different mix of 10x programmers, or maybe it would be diversity, or maybe it would be lack of diversity, or maybe it would be, they thought it would be team makeup. They found that team makeup had nothing to do with their high performance teams. Instead, the thing that made their high performance teams stand out was psychological safety. They called out two characteristics. They said, mutual respect encourages sharing from everyone on our high performance teams. And they said that psychological safety provides their teams with the opportunity and the safety to speak up. And then they said something true for me, truly magical. They shared, I think it's 7 words, that describe that. They say, we can see psychological safety. You can walk into any of their high performance teams and you can see psychological safety, because in those teams, there is equality in distribution of conversational turn taking. There is no one who dominates the conversation. There is no one who's silent. There is equality in distribution of conversational turn taking. Amy Edmondson said it's not enough to just build psychological safety. We also have to set high standards. And she shared a quadrant, looking at low versus high psychological safety, looking at low standards versus high standards, and said, if we've got to just have high psychological safety, our teams are just going to sit there in the comfort zone and be comfortable. What we want is our teams to be in the learning and high performance zone. And to do that, we need to both set high psychological safety and to also set high standards. One of the learnings for me as a manager, and I was probably 4 or 5 years into management when I discovered this, is that things that motivate are not the same as the things that demotivate. That just as we need to actively motivate, we also need to actively block out those things that would demotivate the individuals on our teams and our teams together. The thought leader in that was one of those. So I said that Mickey and I examined a couple of pages each. Maslow and McGregor and Hertzberg was a third of those. Frederick Hertzberg basically said, there are things that motivate there, but there are also things that demotivate, and you've got to eliminate the things that demotivate, or any attempts to motivate will go kaput. So we've got a number of charts in our books. This is a modification of Hertzberg's charts from the 1950s that Mickey and I did, based on what we believe motivate. The blue bars are what motivate programmers. The red bars what demotivate programmers. Programmers are more motivated by making a difference in the world. Most of us got into engineering because we wanted to make a difference in the world. We wanted to make an impact, sometimes on our spouses or our kids or our girlfriends or our boyfriends or our colleagues. Or we wanted that big impact on the world. And then there's learning and growing and toys and technology and recognition and praise. These are all motivators, but they're useless to try to motivate if the demotivators are there. And notice the number one red bar there is respect for supervisors. So these are think of them in reverse. If people don't have respect for their supervisor, they're demotivated. If they don't have ethical management, they're demotivated. If the company policies and administration suck, they're demotivated. So nobody, I've never met anyone who said, oh yeah, I went to work for that company because of its company policies and administration. But I have found people who've left companies because of company policy and administration. So we need to pay attention to both motivators and demotivators. Then we really need to stay focused on what's important, and that's delighting customers. Here's Joe Kleinschmidt, who was a CTO in San Francisco and now a CEO there, who said in the beginning, everybody's going to talk about scope and budget and schedule, and you're going to have a bunch of people who are pounding on you for those things. But in the end, that's not what matters. What matters is people will love our software or they won't. And that's the criteria, the only criteria that we should truly manage to, because that's what keeps us in business. That's what keeps our companies in business, is people loving our software. So we have to be careful about what we reward. And this is a new idea as we become managers as well, because we've only been rewarding ourselves as programmers. Now we're rewarding our teams. Jim Highsmith, one of the early agilists, said behavior revolves around what you measure. If you reward heroes, why would anyone be a farmer? Why would anyone spend their time building software day after day after day, week after week after week, if the person who gets rewarded is the person who comes in at the very end to save the day? We need to form some kind of balance between rewarding the day-to-day work and some amount of rewarding for the heroes, so that if we need someone to be a hero, they'll step up, but we never need to ask them to do that. Here's a rule of thumb that is, I think, a really important one. So I was sharing to never, ever, ever share velocity outside of the team. Velocity being an agile concept, maybe a Scrum concept, that allows teams to be predictable against their backlogs. But if it gets shared outside the team and the team begins realizing that if velocity is being measured, or they're being measured against some other team's velocity, suddenly their velocity will go up, but their outcomes and their output won't. Their output will stay the same, their outcomes will stay the same, but their velocity will go up. All of us know how to make velocity go up. We just have to give higher point values to all of our stories, and we can make our velocity go up. What gets measured gets manipulated. And at the point at which velocity goes up and outcomes and output don't, we no longer have a measure that we can use for predictability either. We have destroyed ourselves. If we define done as coding complete and not done as features that delight customers, we have missed the boat. Going back to that rule of thumb from Joe Kleinschmidt, we need our sole focus to be on making software that make our customers happy. And finally, in the motivating category, be very careful trying to reward with cash. So unexpected spot bonuses, great. But to say, oh yeah, so I'll give you more money if you meet this date, I'll give you more money. Suddenly people are working for money. If you want to dig into this one, Daniel Pink has written a terrific book called Drive that truly puts the kibosh to rewarding with cash. Then we as managers must foster culture. And I think that when I say that, I'm meaning a bunch of different things. One, we need to trust our people. We need to trust our people implicitly and form those bonds of trust with the folks who work for us. We need to empower self-organization and excellence. Our job is not to tell people what to do. Our job is to motivate them to want to figure out what's going to delight customers and do it. We need to expect and enable truly shared leadership. And to do that, we need to build psychological safety and set high standards. We need to model and defend and evangelize agile values. We need to foster a culture of communication. We need to encourage teamwork and collaboration, because software development is a team sport. We need to shield our teams from the politics and the distractions that surround them, the torrent of politics and distractions that in most companies surround them. And we need to take care of stuff. We need to take care of our teams. In talking about establishing culture, this rule of thumb from Juanita Ma, who at the time was an engineering manager, she said, publicly reward or acknowledge engineers who act in a way that supports the culture that you want to create. I think that's a really useful way of thinking about rewards. And we need to learn to manage up. We need to manage our bosses much more than we ever did as programmers. Jim Kouzes said the single most important leader in an organization is your immediate supervisor. And Joe Folkman pointed out that you can safely assume that all perceptions are real, at least to those who own them. This is a hard thing to learn because we're now in the people management, people skills, people ability kind of space. And perceptions can differ. So we need to help our managers form the right perceptions of us and of our teams. Mickey and I, shortly after writing the first edition of our book, which came out 8 or 9 years ago, we were being interviewed together, and the interviewer. We've got 300 rules of thumb in the center section of our book. And the interviewer said, so what's the most important rule of thumb in your book? And both of us blurted out the same one: always be recruiting. In terms of building teams, in terms of building great teams, in terms of getting the right people onto our teams, it really is our most important job. We need to always be recruiting. We need to always be out there. We need to always be interacting with the world. We need to form relationships with candidates. We need to form relationships with candidates who we may not hire until 4 or 5 years from now, or even 10 years from now. But we want to build those relationships so that we can come back to that person at some future time. We want to maintain a relationship with the people who say no to our offers, because we may get the opportunity to make them an offer again. We, at the same time, and I think one of the reasons that we get reluctance in the recruiting end of things is that sometimes we hire problem employees, and sometimes we inherit problem employees. So if it's not one thing, it's another. There's no perfect recruiting record, and even if there were, you'll inherit a problem employee. And so we need to learn some skills around handling problem employees, because our teams expect this. Our teams know if they've got a problem employee on their teams, they know, and they expect us to know, and they expect us to take care of it. Now, Marty Brownstein was my coach in dealing with my first truly problem employee. I'm going to recommend his book to you. Handling the Difficult Employee is a terrific approach to dealing with. It's a process that I'm going to call intervention, and it beats performance plans and firing hands down. It requires a ton of preparation, a ton of commitment, a ton of time, but it's focused on fixing issues earlier, turning employees around, or having them decide on their own that they're not a fit and leave. I want to talk about not bullying our way into management for the first time, and I think this is an anti-pattern that too many of us will have, and it's because we bulled our way through programming. Many of us have bulled our way through one programming language after another. How can I not just figure this out? And the fact is that the skill sets are so different that we really need to focus on learning management in order to be good managers. And so in becoming better managers, I want to talk to you about these 6 things. First of all, training. I lucked into my first management roles being at Apple Computer, which had a significant manager training program. Now, it didn't have anything that I can remember in the way of training us about managing the uniqueness of programmers, but it really did have good management programs. 3 that I benefited from. I started at Apple, and my boss said, "You will take Managers in the Law." Managers of the Law at the time was an Apple class taught by Apple's lawyers, and it was a half-day class. It's probably a 2-day class by now, but it was a half-day class, and it was shocking to me as a manager how much I really did need to know about the law and managing. And I came back from that class, I came back from that half day in that class and thought, boy, if there's that much that I don't know about managers in the law, let me look at the rest of the catalog at Apple University and think about what else I should learn. That second class was situational leadership, which was where I learned that micromanaging and throwing people in the deep end and seeing if they're sink or swim are two ends of a scale, and there's a really sweet middle, and that sweet middle varies based on the individuals that we're managing. The amount of delegation, the amount of support, the amount of enabling that we need to do as managers is situational. And then I took a number of classes that I took after that had content that included reflective listening, the ability to not just talk. I mean, in high school, there are classes in speaking, but there are no classes in listening. And reflective listening is a way of giving the person who's talking to you confidence that they're being heard. And that's really important in forming relationships with your reports, with your peers, and with your boss. Fourth, and I'm going to point out that what I pointed out earlier, that Mickey and I went into Addison Wesley Pearson's studios and recorded our book as manager training. And as I said, I'll give you a discount code for both the video and the book at the end of the talk, which we're nearing. So becoming better managers, well, there are books. Our book, that's the white cover, is the first edition of our book. The second edition, which came out a year and a half ago, has a black cover. And we added an entire chapter on what it means to manage in an agile organization. But see, our book is centered there on half a dozen other books. There were only a couple more than what you're looking at books on managing software developers in the history of programming. There are very few books now today. What is this, 9 years later? There are probably twice as many books on managing, but there's still very few. There are so few that you can buy all of them and get value out of all of them. And I encourage you to do that. Books are a great way to learn how to become a better manager. Third is mentoring. Get mentoring from your boss, get mentoring from your peers. When you become a manager, get mentoring from your network. It's how Mickey and I came to write Managing the Unmanageable. Was I applied for a job that Mickey had. I was a director of engineering. Mickey was a VP of engineering, trying to hire another director. I interviewed with him. It was such a great conversation that I came back to him, and I took another job. I had 3 offers at that point. But I came back to him and said, could we have breakfast could we have a breakfast on this weekend or a coming weekend and continue the conversation we were having during that interview? It was so interesting. It was so fascinating. And he agreed. We had breakfast, and it began a series of breakfasts over the course of a decade. We were having breakfast talking about the challenges of managing software developers and software development. And I was getting mentoring, but we were essentially co-mentoring each other and sharing with each other rules of thumb that ultimately became the center section of our book. So ask other managers about the most important lessons that they learned, about the mistakes they made, about how they solved those problems, about the surprises of managing, both good and bad surprises, and about where they find their sources of strength and support. And ask your reports. Practice that reflective listening. Ask your reports what they want in a manager and what they wish they could change of you, of their team, of themselves. And then leverage meetups. So I co-chair the Silicon Valley Engineering Leadership Community. There's also a San Francisco Engineering Leadership Community. I co-chair the managing software teams in Seattle meetup. There are agile leadership groups. Get that benefit of experienced leaders talking about their experiences and their learnings and their challenges and their solutions. And then leverage rules of thumb. So I'm going to share just a few more of the rules of thumb that are in our book. As I said, there are 300 there, and there are more on the website that support the book. David Vidra said pair programming during an interview, pair programming for half an hour will save everyone's time. Not only do we learn how that candidate programs, but we learn how we collaborate together, and software development is a team sport. Uncle Bob Martin, one of the co-authors of the Agile Manifesto, said that writing clean code is what you must do in order to call yourself a professional developer. Mickey and I have both used that with an occasional programmer on our teams who was reticent to refactor and clean up their code. And Fred Brooks Jr., who wrote The Mythical Man Month back in the 1970s, was the author of Brooks Law, who said adding manpower to a late software project will make it later. One of the values and rules of thumb is we can say to our management, hey, I didn't make this stuff up. We've known this for 45 years. As I said, we've got 300 rules of thumb and nuggets of wisdom in the book and more at the website listed there. So here's my contact information. You may want to take a screenshot of that. And here are those discount codes for our book. So remember, what you want to do as you transition to management is really focus on the management part. Don't think you can bull your way in. Expect you're going to have to learn a ton. Some of that learning is from your people. And I have to say my first reports when I started becoming a manager suffered through my becoming a manager. And the more learning you can get earlier, the better off you're going to be. If you've not gotten the message yet, I love the role I've grown into over the past 20 years managing the delivery of awesome products. It's been rewarding in ways that I could never have imagined. What I've been showing you in the past 40 minutes or so seems exciting to you. I hope you take that excitement to the next level and put some of it to use with your own projects and teams. I've enjoyed sharing some of what I've learned over the years and wish you the best of luck and hope that you can take something of this presentation with you.
Hello and welcome back. This is your panel here. Thank you, Ron, for putting together that interesting first-time manager presentation. And we have a few questions we thought of ahead of time, and people who aren't able to attend this video sent to me. And let me take a few moments here and ask you those. So one of the things you talked about was your team's psychological safety. Well, can you talk a little bit more about that, and how do you actually build psychological safety?
Yeah, I think it's let me start with a couple of a little bit more in depth. So Esther Derby, who is the co-author of Agile Retrospectives, making good teams great, explains that psychological safety does not mean that you feel comfortable all the time. Psychological safety is that you feel comfortable talking about what makes you feel uncomfortable. I think that's a helpful way to understand psychological safety. Amy Edmondson, who's that professor who I brought up from Harvard, and who has studied psychological safety inside and out, she cites 4 reasons why people don't speak up. They don't want to be seen as ignorant, incompetent, negative, or disruptive. So what that means is that as leaders, we need to be vulnerable ourselves, and we need to share who we are in the way that will allow other people to share who they are. So to start with, as for us, as managers and as leaders, we need to admit when we're wrong. There's actually an agile practice called a failure bow, in which you admit your mistakes. So I'll admit not looking into the camera. So Peter's been coaching me for this session. I'm looking into the camera, and I look off and not looking into. So I'm gonna stand up and take a failure bow to all of you to whom I've not been looking into the camera at, and the way the agile practice works is that everyone then applauds the person taking the failure bow, and it's a way of being celebrated for having a failure, and also a way of cementing the fact that I want to do better. I want to do better. I the person taking the failure bow, and I think that can be helpful. We want to share with our reports our failures and our learnings. And I actually learned this being a parent with my kids when they moved into junior high and high school and began getting totally skeptical of their parents. And so those of you who don't have kids probably remember that period of being skeptical with your parents. One of the things, so telling them what to do at that point is a difficult way to get them to do things, but it can be helpful to say, to share with them the failures that you had as a kid, and the result of those things, and say, well, you could do it like I did, and this is what the results were. So sharing your failures can be a very useful way of giving examples, as well as sharing, creating an environment of psychological safety. Hey, I'm willing to be vulnerable here. I'm willing to tell you what I did wrong. And then there's something called the prime directive for retrospectives. So those of you, probably all of you, are doing Agile in some way or another. What that means is that probably all of you are doing retrospectives in some way or another. And the man who wrote about retrospectives before Agile, Norm, and I forget his last name, but look for retrospective, Google retrospective prime directive, and what you'll see there is a prime directive that some of us read at the beginning of our retrospectives, because it reminds us that if we knew when we started the sprint, or if we knew when we started the project what we know now, we wouldn't have made those mistakes. But we did make some mistakes along the way, and instead of blaming ourselves and blaming each other for those mistakes, we need to celebrate the learnings that came from those. And so all of these, whether it's admitting mistakes, or whether it's modeling curiosity, and modeling asking questions, and maybe even modeling asking dumb questions, admitting when we don't know something. So when somebody throws out an abbreviation or an acronym, asking though, what is that? And sometimes they're the most obvious things, but it's helpful to everyone else, because there's probably somebody else in the room who doesn't know what it is either. So all of those, and not blaming as well. So all of those are ways of creating psychological safety on our teams.
And that makes a lot of sense when you're the leader, the manager, sort of leading the team. Another follow-on question that we just got in the chat is it possible to build psychological safety when your supervisor, manager, or your organization doesn't really care about it?
So I think that all of us can contribute to building psychological safety from where we are. Now, there's one of the things we talk about in the book is creating. We've got a whole chapter on creating culture and creating a software development culture. And one of the things that we talk about is that it starts from understanding your corporate culture, your company culture. What is that company culture? And that starts from looking at what are the company's values and mission, and then is the company living up to its values and mission? So we know that Enron had, so those of you who remember Enron had wonderful values. The fact is that they operated at a 180-degree difference from those values. but they had wonderful values. And one of the things we can do is we can leverage those values, and we can leverage those values whether we're the leaders or whether we're individual contributors by saying, you know, one of our values is fairness. One of our values is delivering value to our customers. One of our values is, and we can use that value as leverage to building the culture that we want, including building a culture of psychological safety.
And maybe a follow-on to this is, in your presentation, you talk about managing up or managing your manager. Can you talk a little bit more about what does that mean to manage my manager?
Yeah, so there's a rule of thumb, and there's a rule of thumb, and I shared it during the presentation that perception is reality, and the fact is that your manager's perception about you and about your team is reality, and managing your manager means managing the perception that your manager has of you and your team, and helping your manager to understand the value add that you have and the value add that your team has for the mission of the company. And so you're managing, you're managing perception.
You're managing perception. Can you talk a little bit more? How do you manage perception?
PR. You explain the contribution that you're making. You explain the contribution your team is making. You make the connection, and we need to do this with the people who work for us as well. Make the connection between what's the company's mission, what's the difference that our company is making in the world, and what's the difference that each of the individuals on our team is making. And sometimes we need to mirror that back to our managers when we're managing up.
Ron, let me just jump in here for a second. The other thing you can do, it's important to do in managing up, is understand what kind of communications your manager wants. Giving them too much information or too little information, both of them are bad. So you have to figure out exactly what the right thing is, make sure you're giving them the right amount at the right times. That's an important ingredient in managing up.
Yeah, a great point, Mickey. I had a manager at Schwab, actually, who new manager. My métier is not phone calls, and every morning about 6 o'clock in the morning on her commute into San Francisco, she was leaving me a voicemail, a long voicemail that, and it took me a while. But that's the trigger. That's what we have to listen for, is what is our manager's mode of communication. And in this particular case, her mode of communication was leaving me voicemails, and mine needed to be leaving her voicemails back.
So maybe
I think it's also really important for us to understand what it is that our manager is being graded on, what it is that our manager is going to be rewarded for. We need to understand what their objectives are and how what we do contribute to those objectives. And it's a very
different project on time.
Yeah, for one. One of the there's a ton of objectives, and when we're programmers, you know, it's pretty clear. You know, we've got a bunch of programming to do to make that contribution. As managers, that becomes much less clear and much more nebulous.
So maybe you could talk a little bit about reflective listening. Does that maybe that's part of what you're getting to, is this reflective listening skill, and how is reflective listening any different than I'm just listening to you?
So Tammy, what I'm hearing you ask is, what's the difference between just listening and reflective listening? Is that the question?
That's the question. Have you just answered my question?
Yes.
Okay.
So reflective listening is listening actively, playing that back to the person you're talking to, getting them to give you validation that what you heard is what they said, and or correcting or giving you insight into what the real question was, or what the real statement was, or what the real comment was. And reflective listening, as I said, was part of a number of classes that I took at Apple and at Fujitsu and at Schwab, the three very large corporations that I worked for that had classes for managers. And reflective listening was something that my wife very much appreciated my having learned a little bit more of. I'm still not, I wish I were better at it still, but I'm way better than I used to be.
It feels like it could almost be a little stilted. Is that this reflective listening? Like, yeah, I just told you that. Why are you telling me it again? Do you find that that's the case, or this actually works in a more natural sense?
And so I find that people who are speaking to me when I'm being reflective are actually appreciative that I've either heard what it is that they're saying, or that I'm playing it back because it's not what it is that they were trying to get at. It's not the thing that was most important to them in saying what they said.
However, you can't do it all the time, or it would become annoying.
Yeah, that's true too.
Okay. One of the things you talk about, Ron, is an important criteria for a product is to ensure that people love your product. And as an engineering manager, I could think, well, that's interesting, but that's really not my job as the engineering manager. That's the job of the product manager who works with sales and all the other organizations. And they're the ones that really dial in and need to understand customer love and reflect it back to me. How can I, as an engineering manager, feel much ownership for my customer loving my product?
So I'm gonna contend, Tammy, that all of us in the product organization, developers, testers, UX designers, product managers, are responsible for customer delight. We're all responsible for quality of the product, and we're all responsible for customer delight. And our product, what we count on our product managers for, and I love product managers for the fact that I hope they have time and they're spending a third or more of their time with customers, truly understanding customers and being able to say, well, what's going to delight them is this nuance or that way of creating the product, or this way of designing the user interaction with us. And so UX designers and product managers essentially bring the customer, the proxies for customers. They bring customers into the room for all of us who are engineering managers and engineers and designers and testers, all of us, to understand how we can make that spark of delight in our customers.
Okay. So listen to your overall presentation. You talk about all of the challenges that first-time managers have, particularly first-time managers have. I mean, there's so many things. What was successful before and made me successful before, it's going to be my downfall. I mean, it just seems perhaps a bit overwhelming. As a first-time manager, do you have any suggestions of this whole suite of skills I now need to develop? Where do I start? I can't do it all at once.
Yeah, so I think starting with the recognition that the job is different. It's a different job than I had as a programmer, and I need to I need to make some shifts, and I need to be curious about managing and about what good managing looks like as I was about programming. Secondly, thinking about the best managers that I've ever had and what parts of what they did I want to emulate, and what made them stand out. And I think if you get aligned, if you get synced into that, I think those two things can be really powerful. Mickey, do you want to add anything to that?
Just the converse of that, thinking about the worst managers you've had and what you don't want to be like. That motivated me more than anything. I had a guy who I said, I'm never going to be like him.
Yeah, actually, that's really true. My first manager was a micromanager, And I thought, no, I'm never going to be like him. And so I became a sink or swim manager for a while until I took that training at Apple and realized that there was a sweet spot of delegation and supporting that I really wanted to be. That was the sweet spot where I really wanted my management to be.
Yeah, it's interesting. Some of my role models were the negative role models. I am never going to do what this person did to us or me or my team. We have an interesting comment from Clive here. He says, perhaps surprisingly, leadership training at military academy instills these people management skills. It also teaches how to switch it off and give orders when the plan abruptly changes. So it is common beyond just software development, management and leadership skills.
Yeah, absolutely. I had a manager working for me when I was a director of engineering at Schwab, who had been in the Marine Corps. And my background is not military, but his background was military. And it was very interesting realizing that the military training and leadership that he had really aligned well with Agile, not with command and control, not with telling people what to do, because in warfare, he explained to me, in warfare, when you go into battle, the team has to work together. The team has to have each other's backs. The team, every member of the team has to step up, and it's very much like the model for self-organizing Agile teams.
So thank you for that. We're now going to switch gears just a bit. For those of you who are just joining us, we are wrapping up Ron Lichty's first time manager session, and we're going to switch now over to Mickey Mantle, who's going to do a session on managing remote software development. You can see here on the screen, there's myself, I'm your MC, Ron and Mickey, who have been answering questions. If you haven't had a chance to add questions to our live chat, please do that, and I'll ask them of our two speakers. Ron will stick around, so at the end of Mickey's sessions, if there's still some more questions for Ron, he'll be there to answer them. We have Peter in the background who's running all the controls, and we'll wrap this up at the end. And Joy, who's Peter just went behind the secret curtain again. Joy, who's doing our backup just in case our internet goes down, since we are broadcasting from the desert where the word reliable never goes with the word internet. So Mickey, a very brief introduction to Mickey, and he will give you a little more information in his talk. He's been developing software for 40 years. He started as a system programmer, moved to a tech lead, to a manager, to a VP of engineering, to a CTO, to a COO, to CEO. So a lot of that C-suite in there. And let's turn it over to Mickey's presentation, and we will be back live with you as soon as it's over.
Hello, my name is Mickey Mantle. Along with my co-author, Ron Lichty, we spent years distilling our experience managing software people and teams, and created our book, Managing Unmanageable, published by Addison Whistley Pearson in a fairly recent published second edition. Today, I want to share some insights into managing remote software development. By the way, visit the website we created for the book. You'll find lots of additional information there, including lots of more rules of thumb, one of the best parts of the book, in my opinion. So first, let me tell you a little bit about me. I've been developing hardware and software for over 50 years at a variety of companies. All of them were startups when I started, but they all became large companies, or at least successful companies, and continue to this very day. Over that period of time, I've been managing people and projects and teams and organizations in countries throughout the world, and working with dozens and dozens of customers, large companies, small companies, and others. But I never imagined a world where remote is a complete reality, but at least one person did. Arthur C. Clarke in 1974. But it took a worldwide pandemic to make Arthur C. Clarke's vision of the world a reality. And it's clearly a reality for software people who are working remotely today. We all know that managing programmers is hard, but managing them now is even harder. We recounted many of the reasons for that and what to do to make it easier in our book. All this information is still valid, but now managing programmers and teams and organizations is even harder. Almost 60% of the total US workforce are remote workers. This is mirrored around the world. And many global companies are fully remote now. Unfortunately, these numbers will likely continue to grow if the pandemic continues. If it doesn't, well, those numbers will begin to come down. But managers have to find ways to manage remote workers effectively. They've got to expand their skills and manage remote teams and organizations more effectively. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Time, distance, and culture difference complicate any remote relationships. I learned my lessons about time, distance, culture, managing people and teams 8 to 12 and a half hours distant and a half a world away in Russia, Japan, and India. Somebody has to be inconvenienced whenever you're working that way. The challenges of meeting directly were impacted by these distances, as well as the cultural difference of language, backgrounds, values, and even different holidays. Here's a little bit of what I learned. With time, you have to work hard to make sure that your working hours and the teams overlap. Hiring remote workers in a disparate time zones will only make your job harder. Distance shouldn't matter, but it does. You know, occasionally travel is important, and if the distance is too far, you don't undertake it. If you put people in remote places, they don't have access to major airports or access to travel easily, well, then make travel much more difficult. With culture, differences can impair communication, especially understanding, and national holiday differences can impede your schedules. Having people work together is hard when they take major blocks of time off. I found that out with India and Japan especially. And expectations are going to differ among cultures. My recommendation is to hire staff with time, distance, culture foremost in mind. It's important to make sure that every remote worker's equipment and workspace be adequate for their performance level. You have to work to make sure that they have the right equipment in hand, that it's set up appropriately. And also, you have to double down to make sure that a connection, a personal connection, is maintained with these remote workers. One-on-one meetings, informal chats, and personal visits whenever possible. Also, never overlook the fact that you need formal, quarterly, and annual feedback. However, you've got to look for clues about significant variances in a worker's performance, in communication, in focus, and work records, and especially interaction with teammates and peers. You have to trust your workers, but remember, trust but verify. One of our favorite rules of thumb from our book. I've been burned once too many times by people I trusted completely. Be on the lookout for clues that make you wonder if everything is the way it seems or is reported. So this comic made me laugh when I saw it. As workers work remotely, what they can say that may not really be true. In today's age of widespread security hacks and issues, your remote workers must have a secure environment. With an unsecured facility and family access as a work environment, this is even more important and not a detail to be overlooked. Make sure that you do. A study of Microsoft employees in the US showed that they really stopped talking to each other, the teams, during the pandemic. the workers became siloed. So you've got to ensure your remote workers keep their lines of communication open with their managers, their teammates, and everyone else throughout the company. After all, if it can happen to Microsoft, it can happen to you. You've got to make sure every remote worker understands their responsibility to make working remotely effective, productive, and successful. Reinforce this every opportunity you can, especially in your one-on-ones and quarterly annual reviews. Remote workers have responsibilities they must and should do. They have to continue to add value to everything they do and to make sure they spotlight their own contributions. Meetings are always an important part of the landscape, and they've taken on an even more important part during the pandemic. Remote workers have to prepare for meetings even more rigorously than they did before. They have to maintain a vigorous and vibrant presence during these meetings to remind people that they are vital workers and play an important role. Most of all, they've got to be there. They've got to be there for their teammates who rely on them for lots of things. So it's important to find ways to show them that you're there for them in every way possible. Managing remote workers is hard, but managing remote teams is even harder. Every manager, no matter how experienced, needs to expand their skills and tools to manage remote teams and organizations effectively. GitLab has a lot to offer as an example. GitLab is an amazing company. They've been working 100% remote since their inception. And also, it's amazing that they're completely open about what they do and how they do it. One thing to look at, GitLab's remote manifesto. Like the Agile manifesto, it spells out how they want their workers and everyone else to view them. These are the 9 rules that they think are important for them. And it touches on lots of things that I've noticed working with remote workers all over the world as well. This is something to look at and embrace. They also have a remote work report. I recommend you download it, read it, and learn from it as well. They also have a remote playbook, which is very useful. You can download the playbook and learn how their team members from around the world have been contributing to the company. Last but not least, take the GitLab course, How to Manage a Remote Team. It's free and available online. In it, you'll find 5 different sections which talk about how to take and go about managing a remote team and provides exercises to help you do this effectively. To learn more about GitLab, I reached out to 2 people who used to work for me. They worked for me for a long time, many years. They were directors in the company I worked for then. I asked them what it was like to work for GitLab, and knowing how their work experience was and their background, I was interested to see what kind of things they would say. Here's what they had to say. They both loved working at GitLab. They both found it challenging with the time zones, but the thing they both reiterated was that async communications incredibly important at GitLab. They use lots of tools. Most are pretty familiar, but they rely a lot on Slack, Zoom, Google Docs, Calendly, a fairly small tool bag considering what's out there today. Also, it's a great meeting culture. They don't have meetings just to discuss status. They have meetings to make decisions. Meetings start and end on time, and there must be an agenda. At GitLab, Monday through Thursdays are for virtual meetings. Fridays a no meeting day, time to get their own work done. This GitLab handbook, which you can download from their site as well. Of course, it's like 17,000 pages long by now, contains everything: company culture, values, and operational procedures. One of the comments this fellow told me was, it only works if you keep it up to date. Things can get out of date, and unfortunately, there's no way to know when something changes. So if you're going to do something important that's actionable, driven by the handbook, it's best to check back with it. But everything is expected to be documented. But one of the most telling things I heard was that the middle management is the glue that holds everything together. Now, that's true in many companies. I didn't expect it to be as true at GitLab. So moving past GitLab, there's a lot of tools to help remote communications among teams, to help them collaborate better. You know most of these. We're using one of them now, Zoom, to record this presentation. Slack, Google Meet, Microsoft Teams lead the way among a lot of these tools. There are also many other tools, too many to list here, that have their own set of, people who favor them. Recently, Google announced Google Workspace, and it's trying to raise the bar in competition with Microsoft Office, of course. I wasn't aware what it was. I had to go look it up. It contains all the Google apps, from Gmail to Forms. And they put it all in one convenient bundle where there's 3 different price tiers, depending upon how big the organization is and how much of the resources, i.e. bandwidth and storage, you use. Interestingly, they've also created a series of kits, which they sell, to take and make video conferencing more easy. So I found this interesting. So Google, start my meeting. They're trying to out Alexa Amazon, I assume. So they have these kits, and they partnered with Lenovo, and to take and market it and sell it. The prices are not exorbitant, so small companies can easily afford it, and it maybe even be good for an upscale home office. But unfortunately, such tools don't really help you manage remote teams. For years, I've been looking for tools to help me manage programmers, teams, and projects better. I was so desperate that once I even tried developing a set of software to help me do this on my own. But those efforts fell away due to work pressures by my other jobs. A new generation of dev analytics tools are emerging that provide actual data that you can actually use to understand your projects better. One example is a project in GitHub called Visualizing a Code Base. It digests a repo in GitLab or GitHub and produces a diagram that shows you the organization of a project. It's not documentation per se, but you can learn a lot by looking at it. For example, if you look closely, the circles that are self-contained bits of a project. Within the circles, the size of the circles indicate the size of the files that make up that project. And each of the files are color-coded depending upon the file types, so you can get a sense for exactly what kind of code is in your project. This is the kind of tool I was looking for years to help me understand so I could question what's going on when I see things starting to go awry. It's just the beginning, but it shows great promise. Software is hard to manage because it's so intangible. I look at things like visualizing the code base and think that it can help us understand what a project is like overall, but it doesn't help me in trying to manage exactly what's going on in a project. You have to dive into code to figure that out. You have to figure out how much code is created, modified, reviewed, completed, tested, and most important, how the code relates to the project. There's a new generation of other dev analytics tools that take and help solve this problem. There are many of them out there. Here's the set I've been looking at to try to understand which tools work the best. The way these tools work is they digest the repository that is your source code, i.e. from GitHub or GitLab, and derive on-demand charts, graphs, reports to help you figure out exactly what's going on and what the current status and progress is. Waydev, one of these companies, is a good example of such a tool. They provide many different metrics, including these I've shown here. And they do it in such a way that can actually understand them. This is the way they explain it to their customers. There are repositories over on your left. There are places where ticket activities occur, Jira and GitHub. There's continuous integration, continuous development activities in the third area. And finally, calendar meetings, which integrated into a set of reports which no manual inputs required, and the data is aggregated in real time, making reports available that are never out of date by more than a day, which may be the turnaround time to get the data ingested and reports generated. Here's an example of one of the reports, which just shows exactly what's going on in terms of the code commits, the merge commits, the pull requests, the pulls requests merged, the comments, the reviews. And it shows these by size so that you can determine exactly what's going on for each of the developers in this particular team. You can see how many they've done, and the size, the number is indicated by the size of the circle or diamond shape you see. Now, this provides a lot of insight. You have to look at it closely. You have to look beyond just the graphs, understand what's going on. But using these can help you, for example, do in your daily stand-ups and in your one-on-ones with your developers to ask what is happening, to compliment on the work that's been done, and to understand what work they expect to be done in the future. So these are just one example of a lot of the different tools out there. They're continuing to improve, and what doesn't work for you today may be important for you months later. So you as a manager have to be constantly on the lookout for any tools that provide insight into what your remote teams, activities, and progress can be. Adopting the right tools make managing remote teams easier. Indeed, they may make it even possible. And companies that embrace these dev analytics tools may even provide a competitive advantage to themselves. So to recap, as we focus on managing remote workers effectively, make sure your communication is high bandwidth. Maintain a personal connection with all your developers, and provide the best work environment and tools that you can. To manage remote teams more effectively, managers must continue to expand their skills and tool set. They've got to look to good examples like GitLab to learn what they can on how to do it effectively. And they've got to embrace any and all tools that make managing remote people and teams easier. I hope these insights that I've shared with you today will help you manage your remote people, remote teams, and organizations better. I've enjoyed sharing these with you, and I hope that you do remember that managing remote people and teams doesn't have to be unmanageable. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mickey, for that interesting presentation on managing remote software development, which feels quite apropos because your panel here is geographically dispersed across actually the West Coast. We're in the same time zone, but we're spread many thousand miles apart right now. Mickey, there have been a few questions that have come up that some of them came again ahead of time for people who couldn't attend this live session, and some that popped up in the chat. Let me start off with asking you a question about time, distance, and culture. You say they're important. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Sure. Just when I was talking to one of the GitLab managers, directors I quoted in the presentation, he started out my when I first started talking to him, he said, I want to thank you for giving me a piece of information when I work for you that has been the most important thing for me during my employment at GitLab. He says that was time, the importance of time, distance, and culture. He says, I've used that so much. And so really what's so important about it is that when you go to hire someone, or if they're hired and you have to interact with them, understanding how much time can impact that interaction, okay, if they're half a world away, excuse me, as it was when I was managing teams in India, 12 and a half hours away, somebody was always inconvenienced if we wanted to talk directly. So a lot of communication via email, but you really have to have high bandwidth communication to be effective on occasion. So, the time is important. The distance, of course, is less important when everybody's remote, except for the fact that sometimes you want to be together. One of the most important things I ever learned, at least as a personal lesson from me, was that when I take and have to really understand someone, I can do it via remote, I can do it via phone, I can do it via Zoom, but taking and having eye-to-eye communication in person over dinner or just a meeting, thereafter, somehow the communication is always easier. Mm-hmm. So the distance is important, and you want to take and be able to actually have live conversations whenever it's possible. Hopefully in the next coming months and years, it'll be more possible than it is now even. And finally, culture. Well, of course, culture in this particular context is the culture of the person you're talking to or you're dealing with. Understanding the cultural differences in India, the differences in Japan, and trying to use those to make sure that you're not doing faux pas in their culture, and to understand when they don't understand your culture. So the cultural aspect here is very important. Now, Ron earlier talked about company culture. Now that's different than the culture I'm talking about here. Also very important, but the culture here is more about the individual's culture.
Right, and that seems to me to be one of the more difficult of those challenges that you listed. Cultural alignment seems to be the most difficult, actually, for me. Like, okay, now I recognize that there's different cultures for the norms in India, other countries, even within the US, different populations. What any advice on how to to understand the different cultures and expectations, and then how to align teams to a common culture?
Well, that to me is challenging. I think the most important is to take and make sure you have a set of values set for your company that help define the culture. If you go into our book, we talk about sometimes you have to wall off the culture of your company and create your own set of values and the culture in the group you're managing. Because if the company culture is toxic to what you're doing, you don't want to bring that in. You want to wall it off. So establishing the cultures that represent the values you have, then trying to get others in these remote teams that they can embrace those cultures and abide by them. I think that's the best you can do.
I think I'd add one note. which is holidays. So one of the things you find out when you start managing people in other countries is they have different holidays. And those holidays can be revealing about culture. And so that's interesting from that standpoint.
Yeah, and also just while you're mentioning holidays, understanding those holidays and actually mapping them out. Because, for example, I always had to take an almost wall off January as a development period, because in India and in China, much of January is taken off as a holiday. So you have to take and understand those things when you're trying to make plans around your teams that may not be in those places.
And the summertime in Europe is interesting. I'll use my mother's use of the word interesting. Summertime in Europe is interesting.
Yes,
sure.
August. Yeah, Europe in August.
Europe in August.
Yeah. And so you mentioned, Mickey, about the importance of a good internet connection. Maybe we can reflect a little bit more on the hardware you talked about. You brought up Google's sort of several $1,000 room audio kits. How important is audio visual equipment? Is there any kind of minimum that you think is important? And let me add that we have CDDD, which I believe is Cortland, has some opinions on that. He feels that audio quality is sometimes overlooked, which means the microphones, the headsets, earbuds that I'm wearing now, and the treatment for room acoustics. And for Cortland, for instance, he uses, for his day-to-day use, he uses a headset, a mic on a boom, which is attached to headphones. Can you speak a little bit about having sort of like a good audio setup for your remote individuals on your team?
Sure, I'll give you an example of this. I learned very quickly when we were doing animations and video, is that if you can't keep up to the video, you got to make sure the audio never drops out. So the audio always has priority over video. So paying attention to audio is a very good thing. It's the most important aspect of it. Now, today it's amazing what you can get for very little. I recently upgraded the camera I'm looking at now, and I think it cost me less than $100. That was an upgrade, just a high def camera that goes, and I'm using for Zoom. The audio, I can't speak to it because you're listening to it and I'm not, but I think it's okay. But I agree that people should take and invest in quality equipment if they're going to be online doing remote teams like we're doing all of us in the world, it seems like nowadays. Don't scrimp on that.
Yeah, I was in a meeting of folks who were probably not, it's just one of these Zoom meetings, but the team isn't particularly technology aware. And one of the people in the meeting, I was the new person who joined. He's like, "Oh my God, your audio is so good. What do you do?" I was like, "Well, I just have earbuds." Everybody else was using the mic and the speaker in their laptops. And small things like that can make really big differences.
Indeed.
Yeah, another question from Cortland is, and perhaps maybe we can figure out how to make a little sense of it, is comments on the difference between espoused values, like values and action. Can either you, Ron, or Mickey try to see what he's getting at there?
So I think it goes, if we go back and revisit what Ron was talking about earlier about Enron, okay, they espoused a lot of values, okay, but they didn't live them. In fact, they were 180 degrees opposite often in the way they ran their company. So taking and understanding the values that are espoused and the values you actually want to see. For example, you may not want your teams to emulate the way your managers work or the CEO works. Maybe he doesn't embrace the values even though he espouses them. So, actions often speak louder than words. So make sure that you follow the values and you are leadership in being and embodying the values that you really want to embrace.
Yeah, I'll give you another example. When I was at Charles Schwab, and I was at Charles Schwab for almost 7 years, Schwab had wonderful values that in my experience, at least at that time, that Schwab lived those values. And there are values like fairness and values of teamwork and values of relentlessly delivering value to our customers. And I was leading an initiative at one point at Schwab. I was leading an initiative for our CIO to basically create teamwork across all of the software development organization. So across 1,500 software developers who up until that point had been able to choose any software they wanted, any platform they wanted. So you can imagine our data center was supporting Microsoft technologies and Java technologies and C++ and pretty much every language that existed other than Spitball and Snowball. I'm pretty sure we didn't have any Spitball or Snowball in our data center, but pretty much everything else. And so we were trying to unify that. And one of the things that I was trying to create was this environment. It was a culture of sharing. Culture of sharing fit very well with some of those values, but the relentless delivery of software too often caused developers to put on blinders, like the horse blinders that we see from the 1800s, put on blinders and not learn from the very developer who was sitting next to them, not share what they were learning with the developer sitting next to them. And so what I then found having to do was to emphasize one value over another, and that value of teamwork I had to emphasize over the value of relentlessly delivering software to our customers, because ultimately that culture of sharing was going to result over the middle and long term in delivering much more software to our customers by not blocking ourselves off from each other.
And probably better software.
Mm-hmm. And that too.
Yeah, and Cortland's is chiming in, agreeing with you in some sense that values and action really come to play when you have those difficult situations. And research shows that there can be a gap between espousing and living to your values when things are running easily and then when things get really tough. But let me follow on this sort of tool thing that you brought up, Ron. One of the things I found is challenging is introducing a new tool. So as a manager, as a leader, and you talk some of these dev analytics tools, Mickey, there's a whole bunch of them we could talk about, but let's say you as a manager wants to bring in a new tool or use a new tool. Can you talk to what it takes to get your team to buy into using this new tool and feel comfortable using the tool and spending the time to learn how to use it? Can you talk about introducing a new tool and making it effective in your team?
Well, I'll back up a little bit. Before you bring in a tool, make sure your organization is ready for the tool as well. For example, if there's cost, you better make sure it's budgeted and that your CFO has bought into it as well. So if you don't have buy-in from the company, going in and spending a lot of time on a tool, which they then won't support and purchase, is needless. So save your time and money, or money you don't have, I guess. But going back to what you do with tools, in your team, and especially with some of these dev analytics tools, the team could feel that you don't trust them. They feel like they don't.
Right.
You're trying to spy on them, but
Right.
really you're not. You're trying to help them be better. The analogy I like to use for these kind of tools is, if you look at the sports world today, okay, any baseball game, any football game, it's any tennis game, any golf game, you look at those games and it's filled with information about how the team or the individual is doing. Okay, do you think these players push back at that? No, they actually embrace it because it helps them be better people, better players. And so if your team as software programmers feel that these tools are kind of giving too much information they don't want to share, well, they should embrace it as a way to help them be better programmers. So you have to educate them. You've got to be careful on becoming heavy-handed with it in any way. These tools, it depends on which ones you choose, but they can be very illuminating, help you do management of these projects better and faster and more effectively. But if they're heavy-handed, it's going to take and lower the morale of your team and cause problems in another area. So there's a careful balance here, but go slow and take your time and don't try to change 180 degrees overnight. By the way, learning these tools is not easy. It takes a long time to take and ramp up on them. So embrace them is not something to be undertaken lightly.
Yes, so two questions. One is, can you get sort of unintended consequences from the tools? I looked at the presentation where you talk about you have circles and diamonds, and there's these little circles and these big circles. And as a software developer, I want to have big circles. And can that create sort of perhaps like code bloat, or depends on how the tool measures it, or like unintended consequences of this measurement?
Right, right. So one of the fears of these kinds of tools is you're going to be rewarding the wrong things. I was reading a post the other day. Someone said, if I use this, then all of the changes, I had a developer who went back and created more aligned to all the comments in all of the code. Okay, so they're not meaningful changes, would have showed he had done a bunch of changes. Right. So you can't just look at the numbers, you've got to look beyond them. Okay. But if you're trying to help the team, okay, you're going to know that this guy, he couldn't make that many changes. He's not our top developer. He's off commenting code. I'm going to ignore that. But then look at the people who actually are contributing and see how they're doing. So, you have to work it out. But I think that it's the kind of tool that was well worth the time and effort you have to spend to take and do it right.
Yeah,
We're edging into we're actually a little more edged into than edging into the topic of metrics. One of my more recent blog posts began with the words, "Don't ever, ever, ever let velocity be used as a measure of productivity or performance." And the reason, one of the reasons for that is so I shared this with a client in Arizona, and the client was the group of people just lit up. They said, "Oh yeah, we've got a rule of thumb for that. What gets measured gets manipulated."
Mm-hmm.
And remark, and it's the best, one of the most concise rules of thumb I think I've run across is what gets measured gets manipulated. And what happens with velocity is if someone outside the team starts measuring velocity, starts watching velocity, and the team becomes aware of that, they will start manipulating it. And you can make velocity go up really fast. All you have to do is change the point sizes on your stories. And velocity will up. The number of stories that are getting done, the amount of delight of our customers, the outcomes, nothing changes, but velocity goes up. And it's a bad thing. And the side effect of that is that because velocity is now manipulated, velocity is no longer useful as a measure for the team to use to be predictable. And so
can I make a counterpoint to that, Ron?
Yes, please do.
That point of view is very cynical. You believe that your team doesn't want to improve. Do you think that velocity, knowing how your velocity is doing, isn't a valid thing to understand?
Yes. So the team. So that was my point. Don't ever let it be used outside of the team. The team needs velocity in order to be predictable. The team needs velocity in order to understand how it's doing.
So you as your manager, are you part of the team or not?
The team needs that internal feedback. So I started a blog post, or started a discussion group on this a year ago or so, and one of the contributors said, "Don't let velocity leak outside of the team." And I thought that was a really useful way of putting it. Is we don't let it leak outside the team. We use it really validly and usefully inside the team.
So you as a manager shouldn't know about it?
So it depends on the instance of Agile whether I'm part of the team or not. But the as part of, so we're sort of part of the team and sort of not part of the team. And so
is that yes or no?
but letting the management outside of our organization, letting the CEO know about it, letting sales know.
Promoting
about
it as a
marketing.
valuable measure. Yes, don't promote it. I absolutely agree. But you as a manager can use it as a useful tool.
Yeah, and as a useful tool for the team's learning.
Yes, for the team.
Yeah.
So we're in heated agreement.
I think we're in violent agreement, Nikki, as we usually are.
All right, so here's another question. You talked, Mickey, about trust but verify. And so to what extent, well, can you talk a little bit more about that? And in the extent you want to build trust with your team, but then you're verifying that they've done what they said they were going to do, it seems like that's a conflict.
Oh, not at all. So let me give you an example, a couple of examples. First of all, one, which I don't think I've ever shared in public before, my experience with one of my companies. So I was part of the executive team, and as such, we looked at financial reports once a month and understood things. And one day, our banker called, said, we're worried. A venture capitalist, one of our VCs on the board, called to say, we just got a call from your bank, and they said they were not going to be able to make payroll. We said, we just had a meeting, and our accountant said that the payroll, we had plenty of money in the bank to pay payroll. So we went to talk to the accountant, and he had left with his laptop that morning and hadn't come back from lunch yet, which was several hours later. Well, it turns out this accountant had been writing checks personal to himself and not keeping track, not making them visible to the accounting system. Okay, so we trusted this guy, but we didn't ever verify it. We immediately implemented rules whereby no one could write a check without 2 signatures. Okay, so that's a result of that trust but verify. Going back to programmers, which is a little bit smaller sort of situation, I had an awareness of someone who was working, they were a friend of mine, but they were working remotely for a company full-time on the East Coast. And they worked every day. They got up early and they worked, for the company. But it turns out they also had a full-time job with a company here on the West Coast. Okay, so they were working 2 full-time jobs, basically 16 hours a day, for which they were really only working maybe 12. Okay, so someone should have noticed that there was something wrong here. Either one of those companies, they did it for years and got away. So they were looking at results, which is good. But I don't believe they ever got the full amount of result they could have got from this person. So sometimes you got to look at the tea leaves to try to understand, okay, this person says what they're saying, but is it really happening? And that's this cartoon I put up on the in the presentation kind of alluded to that. I'm completely swamped. Okay, well, they're in the swamp, right? So sometimes you have to look beyond what people say. You have to trust them, but sometimes you have to verify too.
Ron, do you have anything to add to that, since you guys were in violent agreement before? Is that?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that Amy Edmondson said about we're not just trying to create a culture of psychological safety. We're also setting standards and set standards of expectation for our teams, and those are standards that we're going to verify against, that we're going to get confirmation of.
Now, let me loop back to one more question on tools. Mickey, you showed a large number of dev analytics tools. And if I've bought into something, this is important for my team and I want to do it, it seems like there's like just an overwhelming number of choices, and I can spend way too much time like trying to decide which tool to pick and do an evaluation of them. Or if we take a step back to like, I want to do dev analytics, but I don't want to spend huge amounts of time picking a tool. Do you have any advice for how to go about taking that first step?
Well, so I've been trying to understand these tools myself, and I'm far from understanding all of them. That's for sure. But I found this particular link I put up there is kind of useful, which is an analysis mostly from customer reviews, okay, a ranking of the best tools in this particular space. So customer reviews count for a lot. So that's one place to go to look for some guidance. But I think that going beyond that, one of the things you have to do as you take and evaluate a tool is you have to see what they say and what it actually does. And the only way to really do that is to ask for a couple of references and talk to the people who are using it.
And that's not different from are we choosing a language? Are we choosing a platform? Are we choosing a framework? We getting those references, getting those customer reviews, getting insight into it. It starts with what it is we're trying to get out of that tool. And all of the people on this call probably have some subtle differences between what it is we're trying to get out of that kind of a tool. And so we need to start with the requirements.
Right. And also make sure you do a test project. Don't just jump in feet first, into the deep end of the pool. Wade in through the shallow end and take and make sure you understand the tool and do it on a small number of things, not a big number of things. That's my recommendation.
And we have a couple more comments in our chat about getting back to culture and leadership, and particularly one of the cultures that got picked up was the Indian culture, where there's the expectation that the manager is a leader and in control, and perhaps different than some of the other cultures that come out of more global countries or from a more mix of them. Is there kind of any other, particularly if you're working with a culture, that the expectation within that culture is strong leadership, but it's our desire to build, what's the Aristotle project from the Google about equal communication? I thought that was really interesting, Ron, that Google's high performing teams, everyone spent sort of equal amount of time talking. How do you sort of work with some cultures that don't consider that to be strong leadership, where other perhaps really analytical given companies like Google say, well, actually that's what works best?
Well, quite frankly, let me just jump in for a second. Maybe Ron can pick it up after that, but I think that what's best for you isn't necessarily what Google says. What works for a company with unlimited dollars, and an unlimited number of people isn't necessarily good for a startup. So be careful about emulating Google in all things. That said, in this particular thing, it might make sense to take and make your teams more communicate better. But I think you have to be careful emulating Google, Microsoft, Apple, these companies with $1 trillion market cap and unlimited funds and so forth.
So I'm going to disagree with Mickey on this one. On this particular point, that I think that equality and conversational turn taking is a useful measure regardless of where our team is. I've talked to a ton of startup managers and startup directors and VPs of engineering and CTOs, and about that question, Tammy, which is, how do we bring that kind of conversational turn taking to other cultures? And what I find is that that while the culture itself may support something different, we can find those people who are those programmers for our teams who have that, who are willing to step up and be proactive and be part of a self-organizing team. And we can find people who are reticent to do that here in the United States as well. And if that's the team, and it goes back to requirements, if that's the team we're trying to build, then maybe some of you want to build micromanaged teams. I hope not. I hope not for the benefit of your teams. But what are your requirements for your team? Those are the requirements that we need to look for in the managers we hire for those teams and in the programmers who are going to be part of those teams. So I often talk to Agile, to startups more often than not, but also to very large companies. If you brought in a summer intern that equality and conversational turn taking applies to the summer intern as well. And it's not because the summer intern is going to architect your system, although I've had some pretty remarkable summer interns, but probably they're not going to architect the whole system. But if you don't have an intern who is bringing some experience and some expertise and cannot step up and share that at the appropriate time when that expertise or experience might be useful to your team, if they don't have that something extra, you probably hired the wrong intern.
Yep. Yes, I've had some excellent internships too. So Mickey, question for you directly from Frank. Any suggestions on how to pick remote teams, e.g. teams in India, to help startups? And I assume this is a startup here in the US and needs extra engineering help and is looking to find a remote team in India to help them. Any suggestions on how to pick them?
Well, so I have, it's been quite a number of years since I was managing teams in India, so things have progressed a long way. So I think that understanding what their core competencies are there is key. Okay, and making sure you bring those core competencies into your team if you need them. And if those core competencies don't align with your needs, then they're probably not the right team. So it's like hiring a person on steroids to hire a team or a team of programmers in India or any other place, quite frankly. You've got to be very careful about what you do. And again, wade in from the shallow end of the pool. Don't just dive into the deep end. You've got to start and be able to back off and terminate a contract if necessary, if it's not working out. And don't be afraid to do that.
And if you're hiring a team from anywhere, whether they're in the United States or whether they're in Canada or whether they're in India or China or Eastern Europe or South America, get some references of folks who worked with that organization, and now you can have a conversation about what you're looking for, about what they were looking for when they brought that team in, and what they got, and what that you can have some really insightful conversations with other people who've used that vendor.
How important is it when you're hiring a remote team that you or your team has some skill set, that you have the skill set that you're hiring for? So as an example, say your team is deep into database and data science, and that's in sort of back-end server technologies, and you're looking for help in the graphical user interface, React, Angular, sort of front end. How important is it that you have some of that sort of React, Angular, whichever the graphical interface you want, expertise at yourself, versus that's something that you can completely outsource?
So there's a couple of different situations there. First of all, if you're hiring consultants, if they're not full-time employees, you might look for something different than if you're trying to hire full-time. Okay, if you're trying to hire full-time, you don't necessarily have to have all those experiences, okay, although you have to be able to judge whether they're doing it accurately and adequately. Okay, so you have to know enough about it to be able to manage it. Okay, but if you're hiring consultants, you're looking actually for people who actually have expertise that you don't have. Okay, and you're trying to bring that in, usually for a limited amount of time until you can build that expertise internally, or if the project is a finite duration, you don't need it anymore. But I've hired consultants as experts where I have no idea what they're doing, specifically to solve specific problems for me. So it really depends on the situation.
So
Even when we're bringing in employees and consultants into areas that we've got patents in, if we've been managing for very long, we become more and more separated from the technology itself. Our skill set, we're hiring people who are better than we are. I'm always, I don't know about you, but I'm always hiring people who are better than I am.
So to that extent, if it is something that you don't have sort of depth in, how can you evaluate whether your consultant, your external team, is doing a good job?
Well, how do you determine whether anyone is doing a good job? But frankly, it's driven by results. If they're not delivering results that you can quantify, then you're probably not managing it correctly.
So we're running, it's past sort of 11:30 here on the West Coast. Ron or Mickey, do you have anything that you wanted me to have asked you, or is there anything that you want to add as we're sort of wrapping up our session here?
I think, yeah, the summary of my own talk is worth repeating, which is that there is real gratification to be had in managing, and you have to be willing to let go of the incredible ecstasy of solving hard programming problems, and recognize that what you're doing is creating an environment for an entire team or an entire organization to get that ecstasy, and that we are together building an opportunity for delighting customers.
And just let me go back to what I would like to summarize is managing remotely is hard. It's even harder than managing all these programmers we've been doing over the years because of the distance, time, and culture aspects that impede communication. So we have a favorite saying in our book, which is, you can never over communicate. And I think that in managing remotely, that goes double. So managing programmers remotely is a challenge. Communicate as much as you can and do as much as you can to make it even easier on yourself and on them.
Thank you. And so over to you, Peter, to bring us home now.
Well, thanks, Tammy. So, gosh, I'm here. That means the meeting has either gone really well or we're just talking into space and nobody's actually listening. But seems like the meeting went pretty well. So most important, I want to thank everybody for just contributing and making this run so smoothly. I sort of feel like this is the end of the big code camp. I'm not as exhausted as normally I am, so I can actually speak coherently. So specifically, Ron and Mickey, thank you so much for putting your presentations together and then staying here for the Q&A, and and Ron especially for, I think I screwed up his video at least 3 times. Once I got it out of alignment, once I got the slides out of alignment. Hopefully this time it was right. You guys didn't say anything in the comments. I guess that's true. And Mickey, same thing. I didn't screw his up as often, but I'm sure the mistakes were deeper. And Tammy, of course, thank you so much for like being a great moderator and reminding me to unpin people and enjoy. Turns out we didn't need you, but it was really good to know that you were there just in case we actually did need you. And of course, the unsung hero of the technology for this event is Kenny Spade, who had a really big event or something going on today that he couldn't make it. But Kenny spent hours and hours with me making sure that we figured out all this crazy tech as surprise after surprise came along. When we first talked about doing this, Tammy said to me, "Are you sure you have time for this?" And I kind of said, "Well, yeah, I don't think it's going to take a lot of time." God, that's crazy. Anyway, so very important. This was our first event. So please, feedback, any feedback you had, technical feedback, we could have done something better. I mean, we invented this format. I've seen hybrid versions of it in other places. Basically the sessions followed by Q&A live, followed by recorded sessions, again, followed by Q&A live. Most people don't realize any email I've ever sent out, if you reply to it, that goes right to my inbox. So just reply and I'll get it. I kind of don't understand companies that don't let you reply to their email. It seems sort of like, what's the point of sending the email if you're not interested in what people think? So I guess what comes next, again, with the feedback, if this format turns out to be a success, we could do it on other topics. We could continue this topic. We could do multiple tracks. Personally, I like, the single track format more because we can really focus on one thing, but, I can imagine, not going up to the normal Code Camp 25 tracks, but I could see going to like maybe 2 tracks. So of course, Kenny may have to work overtime for that. So I guess in summary, thank everybody for being part of the presentation. Thank you, audience, for coming and listening to us. And until next time.